Hello, and welcome to Past Your Bedtime. My name's Bev. When someone likens the scientific process of genetic mutation to the difference between either having a Land Rover or a Ferrari in your garage, you know you're in the company of someone with a love of teaching. And let me tell you, today's guest had his work cut out explaining to me the core scientific principles of a regenerative system of farming. Tom Fairfax runs a mixed 1,200-acre farm up in Northumberland. With an army background and a specialism in risk management, taking on the family farm and subsequently transitioning it to a wholly regen system required him to learn everything he could about soil health and regeneration. Now, with his son studying agribusiness at Reading University, he's put in the building blocks for his succession planning with true military precision. From time to time in our conversation, Tom asked me whether I was familiar with a certain biological or scientific term. Each time, and as it went on, I had flashbacks of Miss Clemisher from my chemistry lessons, despairing of me. But Tom did nothing of the sort, giving me enough information to grasp the topic, as well as its relevance to the wider impacts on farming today. So, if you don't know your Haber-Bosch from your epigenetics, perhaps you'll find this as interesting as I did. And any guess that suggests I might be a Bond villain is all right by me. I started by asking him how things are.
It's really good, actually. It's a really interesting landscape, at a geopolitical level as well as a microscopic level, if that makes sense. The whole spectrum is fascinating at the moment.
Yeah.
And I think that from an information point of view, it's asking some really interesting questions of us as farmers. And in a way, I think that, that process is as interesting as anything else and is quite enabling at the moment.
Before we get into some of the more detailed stuff, let me just say, I spotted your piece in, well, it would have been Farmer's Guardian, because I get the print version of that every Friday. And I don't know how much you've seen of my background and why I chose to do this. Effectively, I spent 40 years in corporate life, from leaving school, not completing my A-levels, not going to university, not passing go, and ends up...
That shows enormous form. It's a little bit like passing your driving test the first time, which is not something where you should be terribly proud of. You should have failed at least once.
Well, I did want to go to university, but circumstances at home were parents split up, and I just started my A-levels, and so that kind of threw me for a wobble. And I just thought, I can't stay at home for another 2 years to do this, and then what might be. I need to get out. So
I think
what
it makes
did.
a lot of sense. And I wouldn't not university. I went to university when I left the army. I was on the Simple Minds course at Sandhurst, which was their moniker for the standard military course, which was in the 80s, those of us who hadn't gone to university yet. There was then a graduate course. But, at the moment, it's really interesting. My kids, one of them's second year at Reading doing agribusiness, and one is about to go to Durham. She's just coming back from a gap year. And we have both, my wife and I, have got degrees now, and I did mine when I left the army. We both said to both of them, do not go to university unless you can put a business case around it. Because frankly, and there's some amazing people at university and there's some amazing work being done by academia, but there's a lot of people who are wasting their time. And I think that it's being devalued a bit.
Yeah.
I think that the people who go to university and use it well, absolutely brilliant. I have a bit of a concern, and I'm obviously a bit careful about how I articulate this in public, but you meet lots of people with doctorates who are 27 years old, and a lot of the work they're doing is absolutely fascinating, but a lot of it is absolutely lacks relevance in my sphere, because actually it doesn't make sense on the ground. And there's a lot of fascinating research being done, especially in the regen farming side, and certainly our piece is all about engaging the productive power of the ground and, the natural systems, which are incredibly powerful. And of course, they've got us here after 1.5 billion active years, probably 4 billion years. Incredible, powerful, resilient, but it takes time. And, a lot of, we have a tendency to view very short-term timescales as being the norm. But in fact, a lot of the work that we're doing, we've gone hard and fast on this regenerative transition. We're about 6 years in, and now the system is finally beginning to readjust. And so we've had to retrain our elite seeds. We've had to retrain our ground and the seeds and the ground and indeed the livestock to suit each other. But of course, you then have a whole lot of research which is being done on a 2-year timescale. And they're all producing fascinating results. But they're actually looking at the first 2 years. And we know it doesn't work in 2 years.
Well, I was going to ask you about that because your background is in risk management.
Yeah.
And from the people I've spoken to on this topic,
Mm.
there would appear to be some reticence to switching to this system because the risk posed is that it will take 6, 7, 8 years for things to recover to the previous yields or exceed previous yields, and that is far too big an economic risk to take if you're already marginal profitability.
Yeah, this is a challenge, of course, but it's interesting from a risk point of view. The risk of being eggy and boring, which means that's exactly what I'm going to do. If in doubt, just switch off the thing. That's an impact, not a risk. So the impact is this yield deficit. One of the things I'm doing at the moment is we're planning an adopt. I don't know whether you're familiar with the adopt scheme, which is this farmer-led research framework that's being driven by Innovate UK, very powerful, as ever, slightly naive, because of course government may consider itself to be the custodian of best practice, but isn't really. They're very good at what you might call delivering short-term governance, although one might question that on the basis of the evidence in front of us at a geopolitical level. But anyway, and that's about using wool hydrolysate. So what we're doing is fermenting wool to produce a nutrient boost that will allow people to bridge this initial gap without causing problems. One of the challenges, we went hard and fast on our transition because we didn't have an option. We got quite thin ground. We're a mixed farm, so we were quite well suited because the yield deficit, if you like, the yield drop is much more tangible in an arable system than a stock system. In fact, we found that the moment we stopped chucking nitrogen about, I took my feet on the ground, my livestock down by about a third, because everybody said, oh, you won't be able to fatten anything without nitrogen. Of course, entirely the reverse is true. And that became true within a year. Because, of course, nitrogen is fine if you're producing continental cross cattle or sheep, which like high sugar grass. And indeed, quite a lot of the best practice looks at how much sugar you've got in your grass. Actually, if you look at the livestock and you have the right livestock, the moment you stop putting nitrogen on the ground, the competitive aspect of your perennial ryegrass diminishes, which means you get all the other complex species growing in the ground. And so we're finishing our sheep quicker and better than we were when we were using nitrogen, because what's going into them is a lot more complex. But that's multifactorial. That's a combination of conditions, the sheep, the cattle, so the bloodlines, the fact that we're in closed herds and closed flocks, so they're used to what we're doing. So the assumption that there's a yield drop is absolutely accurate if you're an arable farmer, but not if you're a stock farmer. And because arable is our third priority, we could actually do a lot of transition using the livestock as engineers. So suddenly it's easier. So we went cold turkey effectively, and I stopped using nitrogen. We did get a massive yield drop. We changed up. The other thing is that you've got to very much change your mindset. You can't just stop using nitrogen. you've got to start farming in a different way. So we've switched from an input-driven model to a nutrient cycling model. If you have the arable that we are growing, for instance, we're growing our target species out of a green canvas.
What does that mean?
That means that we're growing lots of herbs, forbs, clovers and things. We manage the competition, so we keep our target species, our target crop competitive using height, light, soil temperature, season. It's multifactorial, but generally speaking, your cereals start growing at about 4 degrees soil temperature. Your clovers don't start, and your forbs don't really kick off here, certainly, until about 8 degrees. So that means you can get your cereals away ahead of your
game,
your other stuff. By the time the other stuff kicks off, the cereals are dominant. Of course, it doesn't work every year, so the risk comes in if you get a year where you get an Indian summer or you get a different year. But by the time, and this year has been a very good example, by the time that the supporting crops and the companion crops are kicking away, the cereal, I'm growing a lot of rye this year, is very dominant. So the supporting crops are struggling. Now, because we're not putting on any inputs and we're relying on the nutrient cycling in the ground, those supporting crops, although they're struggling, they're not competing for nutrients. Are you familiar with nutrient efficiency?
No.
Simplistically, it's the amount of the nutrients you put on your field that are used by the plants. And this was a real eye-opener to me. Take phosphate, which is the worst. It's the most extreme example. Phosphate efficiency is 15%. That means of the expensive phosphate, which comes from primarily the Ukraine and Russia, not all of it actually, that you put on your field, 15% of it gets used by the crop. The other 85% of it gets immobilized by the system. Plant available nutrients, which we've been encouraged by everybody to test them, actually, ironically, every 3 years, government best practice, are, in order to be plant available, they have to be soluble. If you live in Northumberland, where do you live?
I'm North Yorkshire.
It's the same. So if you live where you live or where I live, looking at the weather we've had over the last 3 years, a 3-yearly test for your soluble nutrients is possibly not going to be terribly reliable. So what you do then, it's varied, and also, of course, because they're soluble, they get washed away. So what nature does in the natural system is lock them up so they can't get washed away. Because certainly in the northeast of England, especially, or actually in England probably, or Britain, we get lots of water, obviously more or less, depending on where you are. In order to access that stuff that's been locked away, you need a full system and the biology. And so the way that it works in a natural system is that your plant produces carbohydrates from the sky, effectively, from the sun, using the sun as power, and from the air, very simplistically. It can't on its own produce the minerals. It can soak up anything that is sloshing around its roots, but it can't actually generate anything that is immobile. But what can produce that are microbes. So there are things like the bacteria and the fungi specifically at the bottom of this chain, which they can't produce, or most of them, and there's a few microbes that can photosynthesize, but most of them can't produce the minerals. So you have this relationship. 40 to 60% of the sugars that most plants produce, they pump into the ground to recruit a microbial army, which in return are going to generate, they can solubilize minerals. And it's the combination of that, which in the natural system produces the whole, if you like, the whole ingredient list in your menu.
Yeah.
If you are chucking in lots of bag-produced artificial nutrients, of course, there's no need for the plant to recruit microbes. So it's not farming its own community. So that means you degrade and you degrade and you degrade the microbial half of the thing. You don't notice that in the conventional system, and okay, it gives you a nice easy system because you know how many nutrients you put on and what the effect is going to be. And that's relatively straightforward. That's fine until suddenly Donald Trump decides to rev up the Iranians and they close the Straits of Hormuz, or Vlad the Cad decides to invade the Ukraine. Suddenly, you don't have the artificial nutrients, and you have a system which is going to take 5+ years to be able to work on its own, assuming all the other bits are in place. So coming back to the risk piece, and this comes back to the thing that kicked me off. I look at risk, and I was sitting there, my ground was feeling thin, my spreadsheet was looking thin. I was trying to work out how I was going to put the curves were all going down.
Yeah.
And indicating that my business wasn't going to run for much longer unless I did something about it. I've got a son who's looking to take over at some stage. He's currently learning how to farm at Reading. So we had to do something. But I also looked at my risk. And because I've been trained in risk, I enjoy it. And it's my flaw as I see the world in terms of risk. But I see that as a positive rather than a negative. Because the majority of it's like if you we have a lovely tree in the garden, which is a thing called a Parotia persica. Do you know Parotias? It's a lovely tree. It's a Persian ironwood, very slow growing tree, very woven branches. When you were a small girl, age 2 or 3, and I bet this is right for you, it was really irritating because you couldn't climb trees because you couldn't get to the first branch.
Yeah.
This tree is one of those ones where you can, and you can go up through it, and it's really woven. There's a lot of contorted willows and things like that that do it. And even as a 2 or 3-year-old, you can get quite high up, and you can get your head out the top. And if you happen to fall out of it, you bounce a few times before you hit the ground. So you might have the odd bruise, but you're not going to break anything.
And the branches are catching you on the way down.
Yeah, but you learn a lot. You learn not to fall out of trees, don't you? And it's really important that. And this is the same thing. So the risk piece, it's got to be positive. Risk can be very positive if it's used correctly. Looking at my farm, all of my existential risks were owned by me, so they were affecting me, but they were controlled by somebody else. So I was taking prices right through my value chain. I was taking prices for my products, but also for my inputs. I had no power over that at all. I was degrading my system, and I used quite a lot of doctrine from other hats that I've been involved with. I very much look at the power of the ground, the productive power of the ground.
Yeah.
And that is defined by the physical component, which is the stuff that we can see and feel, the tangible stuff. Us, agroecology, cows, sheep, roads, fences. But it's also dependent on the conceptual component. Now, that's our policies and our strategies, how we do stuff. The research, bearing in mind a lot of our research that drives the farming industry has not been done in a nutrient cycling model. It's been done to support the input-driven model. Legislation, regulation, government best practice. Ironically, we're doing a bit of work with trees at the moment. When I look at how many times government best practice with respect to trees has changed through the life of one very short-lived cherry tree I've grown up with, if that makes sense. We do have this thing, we have a tendency to live in the bubble, which is fine so long as we know we're living in the bubble and we can call it out. But so the final bit, which is the important bit, is the moral component of this. I'm calling it productive power. The core doctrine which is a defense doctrine, is called fighting power. The moral component is mindset, it's confidence, but through the whole system. If I, as a farmer, want to make change, but all of my advisors are saying, no, don't, because they don't understand what I'm doing, then I'm never going to effectively make change unless I sack my advisors. and I might not want to do that. If I'm, you were talking about this challenge about the risk of conversion. It's actually, if you're looking at health and safety risk, it's not a risk, it's an issue. You know that it's going to take you a minimum of 6 years and probably more like 10 years to convert your system. Now, and the more you have to, in order to make your cash flow make sense, put in a bit of nitrogen here or a bit of this there or a bit of that there, the longer it's going to take, if that makes sense. So you're balancing the cost, if you like, the impact of a transition. And of course, what we're doing here is we're looking at the reason we have this potential gap in front of us is because we've been farming in a conventional model for, in my case, 30 years, which has meant we haven't had to think about this. But the price we pay for that, and this is one of the things that I think we need to be very cognizant of, the price we pay for that is it's going to be expensive to transition. We've effectively been, if you think through your accounts, we've been depreciating our assets, we've been depleting our assets, but we haven't been depreciating it in the books because we didn't know we were doing it.
Yeah.
If we had known we were doing it, and we were saying, right, I'm going to be putting by £100,000 of my profit every year, not that I make £100,000 of profit, then suddenly I'd have a huge pot of cash to spend on reconverting my system.
Yeah.
So it's that thing about balancing that. So in terms of risk, but having got to that stage and gone through and a lot of my fields are on different cycles. So my system now is incredibly resilient and it's self-buffering. So it's much lower risk system. So for instance, I'm much less affected by the vagaries of Donald Trump or Vlad the Cad. When change happens, it happens more slowly. The system is live, so the system self-buffers all the time. So if I have this moment where, for instance, when I was input driven, my wheat starts looking a little bit yellow. Say in the past, I'd have chucked on nitrogen and it would have gone lovely dark blue-green again, and that's fine. Actually, if you think it through from the wheat's point of view, why is it going a little bit yellow? And the reason is because it's pumping sugars out through its roots to recruit the microbes that are going to generate the fertility it needs. So what we were doing is we were doing soil tests, and we now do total nutrient tests. So we look at all the nutrients in the ground, including the unavailable ones. We look at the ones that are in our current account, which is the broad spectrum soil test that you do, is actually for soluble nutrients. And then we have on occasions, and when we need to, we then do sap tests. And so we look at what's in the plant. And what we were finding was the plant was fine. The available, if you like, the current account was depleted, and we had a hell of a lot in the deposit account. So get back to that nutrient efficiency thing. What we've been doing without realizing it, and it's not blaming anybody, is it's a little bit like putting 85 in phosphate terms. Other ones are slightly different. Phosphate's more extreme. We're putting 85% of our salary into a deposit account that we don't have the key for. And then we're taking huge and expensive borrowing to feed our children. Most farms, I reckon, looking at my figures, I'm sitting on about 150 years of phosphate in my ground, most of my ground. Some farms are sitting on 300-400 years of phosphate in the ground. Different, you've got to keep testing and monitoring, and some of the micronutrients are really important, especially in this system. And so sometimes you do have to add a little bit of an input, but in the right way. And again, there's ways to do that. So the whole thing is working out how we manage that. So getting back to your question, I'm afraid I banged on a bit. It's all about this thing about the risk. What we're doing is we're converting the system, which has quite a big impact. But what we're effectively doing is recovering the lost ground that we've inadvertently lost to create a resilient system, which is much less risk, much lower risk for me. I've also got cattle and sheep as well as the arable. So whilst there's potential challenges there in terms of fences and water and costs and bits and pieces, we do have a more resilient system. Does that make sense?
I struggle with some of it because my lack of knowledge, and I'm very new into this territory. So going back to your point about having 85% of that in the bank, if you like, in the deposit account, are you talking about improving the soil in the way that you manage it, or that you add to it different components?
The main thing that we're doing is changing the functionality of the soil. So the soil ceases to be an inert matrix in which we're growing food and starts to be part of the system. The big change for me, my soil, my ground, is a little bit like a bossy aunt.
I like that comment. I saw that.
You've got a bossy aunt. You know that thing, we've all got one. And you've got to listen to them, however irritating they might be. And you may then decide to discount the evidence, but actually, generally speaking, it's good. Actually, digressing, I had a very amusing chat with my aunt some time ago, who is very wise, and and I was getting really cross with my mother because every time she had something important to say to my wife and I, she used to say it to my wife and not to me. And I was getting crosser and crosser and crosser and saying, but Mum, I've done this and I've done that, and I'm a grown up and I'm in my 50s and that, And I was beefing off to my aunt about this and saying how irritating it was. And she said, Tom, you're being a silly ass. To every mother, her son will always be 7 years old. But she met your wife when she was an adult. So who is your mother going to speak to, the adult or the 7-year-old? And now I understand that. It's cool because I understand it. But,
I like that.
But again, the ground is a bit like that. And so a lot of what we're doing therefore it's about a conversation about how we communicate with the ground. It sounds a bit fluffy, but it's not so much. It might be soil tests, it might be sat tests, it might be, we occasionally, we generate quite a lot of data, but we only generate data that we need to inform a decision. There's a lot of stuff you can collect, and we're encouraged to collect stuff which is pointless in context, and it's expensive. But we're also doing things like, so we do quite a lot of weed reading. Are you familiar with weed reading?
I'm going to say no. It's the third question you've asked me.
If you have
no. I know. Assume I know nothing, Tom. You're pretty spot on.
I know you secretly know everything. But probably, in fact, you've probably got a white fluffy cat underneath the camera, a little bit like Mr. Bond. I've been expecting you. An evil criminal mastermind, sort of making things.
That's a whole other podcast. Carry on.
That we'll probably both get arrested. The weed reading works on the principle that nature is a complex system of systems. And what's fascinating about it is, if you think, just for a second, step back, think about the chain of events that had to link up over the last 1.5 billion years for you and I to be sitting here having a chat over this link. It is utterly improbable that we should have made it this far, if that makes sense. The reasons we have is because the system that we're not only a part of, but a product of, is incredibly dynamic, it's incredibly complex, it's nuanced, and it's diverse. And there's a lot of chat about diversity, but actually diversity is really important at a fundamental level. And we're all terrified, especially today, about complexity. We try and oversimplify stuff, and sound bites and things like that, and messaging, and it's important. There are times when you have to be very careful about clarity, but actually we can't ignore complexity because we're part of it. And if we're going to harness that, we need to find ways to manage it. Of course, we do this every day. We manage complexity. There's areas where you don't drill down into the detail because, frankly, it doesn't affect you, if that makes sense. The stuff you will accept, you look at the input, you look at the output and say, am I still, you drive your car, you don't necessarily, okay, you probably are an utter specialist in terms of the internal combustion engine or whatever it is, but actually you don't need to be, because you just need when the damn thing's not working. It's cool.
Yeah.
So, but actually our lives are the same. But going back to the weed reading thing, we're part of this system. Now, the moment we stop throwing herbicides around and, various inputs, suddenly nature starts using its own tools. Now, everything that grows is growing for a reason. It has a part in the overall system.
Yeah.
We use, are you familiar with ecological succession as a concept? No worries. It's basically, it's a model that we use to look at one lens that we use to look at the farm.
Uh-huh.
It starts with the side of a volcano where you have a hole of nutrient-dense dust, effectively, on the side of the hill. And the first thing that grows in it might be bacteria, or it might be little bits. Think about what grows on your driveway.
Yeah.
Things like bittercress. It grows very quickly. It seeds in sometimes 2 weeks and then dies. And it invests all of its life into this thing of, we're going to cycle quickly and we're going to produce seeds on the ground. We're not going to worry about protecting ourselves. We're not going to worry about growing big. We're just doing bang, bang, bang. Now, as it dies, what it's doing is putting organic matter. Of course, as it's going through that quick cycle, it's sucking stuff out of the sky. It's sucking nutrients out of the ground. And it's beginning to develop conditions for the next thing to come in. And so you start off with, this is why you have pioneer species.
Yeah.
Coming through. And then this process continues as every layer, and it's of course a seamless schmooze through evolution, till you end up with what they call a climax community, which in the UK is basically old growth deciduous woodland. In Northern Europe, it's old growth evergreen woodland, coniferous woodland. And so if you leave your ground, this is why if you leave your garden and do nothing with it, it'll eventually go up this model. And it might take 200 years, it might take 1,000 years. My experience of gardening is it might take 2 weeks.
Seasons.
But anyway, that's a different thing. What counters that is disturbance. And that might be physical disturbance. It might be artificial, it might be natural. It might be something like a flood. It might be something like another volcano. It might be something like a volcano somewhere else, which has changed the climate. It might be livestock coming through. It might be a management practice. It might be chemical. It might be artificial fertility or chemistry or herbicides or whatever it is. It might be a plow. So that basically pushes it back the other way. So you have this wonderful balance. It's a little bit like a dance it's a bit like a tango, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Between these two generic processes. And of course, they're incredibly complex, which is lovely. But so you have this lovely thing coming through. And what happens at the end of that is that either your overall position will be moving one way or another, and it doesn't necessarily move in one direction, because if you put more disturbance in, it'll move back. And then if you take your foot off, it'll move that way again. And then you might get something like Storm Arwen, which then changes it. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Lots of different things. Farming is essentially the balancing of those two things to try and maintain a set of conditions which deliver our farming objectives. The majority of the products of farming prefer to be mid-successional. So think about this continuum. They're about in the middle. So the productive grasses that we feed our livestock, the cereals that we produce for our, to make bread out of, for instance, or porridge or whatever it happens to be. Things like vegetables, brassicas, are just left. They're just below their early successional, if that makes sense. So they like slightly different ground to be optimal. Things like fruit trees are going to be just plus of the middle, just above the middle. So again, what we're doing as farmers is or natural farmers, is create the conditions whereby the system will grow, will support our objectives.
Yeah.
When we put in artificial inputs, nutrients and pesticides and herbicides and things like that, because we're doing it all the time, hammering and hammering and hammering, we effectively, huge disturbance, we take the successional level down. Most arable fields in a conventional system, certainly mine, were light sandy loam, are, from a natural point of view, they're early successional. And the irony to this is that a lot of the herbicides that we were spraying our fields for were to kill weeds which were early successional. If you then take a Brix test, which is one of the things, the brewers, you use this refractometer to look at the sugars, how much sugar is in the thing. We use that to look at the sap. It's showing how well something is photosynthesizing. And the effectiveness of photosynthesis is dependent on many, many factors. Too complex to manage individually or to measure individually. But if something, for instance, isn't photosynthesizing well, there's something that you need to look at.
Yeah.
And you can then look at other things. So, for instance, I was in a conventional system, a lot of really optimal conditions at grade stage where everything's cooking on gas. My wheat would have a Brix reading of 12. My weeds that I was then doing would actually have a Brix reading of 8, which actually 12 is very low for wheat, but 8 is very high for weeds, if that makes sense. So suddenly, the weeds were having a lovely time. My wheat was really struggling. And because I'd created conditions in the soil and the ground for growing weeds, not for growing wheat. Now, I did it last year at the same optimal conditions. My wheat had a Brix reading consistently of about 24 to 26. So twice the amount of sugars being produced by photosynthesis. And the weeds were struggling. They were pathetic. You didn't even need to Brix test them because they didn't have enough light. You could see, I say the weeds, it was the clovers and the forbs and the herbs and things.
Yeah. Not the crop though.
But the moment you harvest your crop, suddenly the limiting factor, which was light, comes away.
Yeah.
And all of your companion crops suddenly boost. And so then they're pumping more stuff into the ground. And so suddenly, rather than competing for nutrients, what they're doing is they're effectively producing more diverse and complex nutrients. So you're managing the competition piece, you're going around. But the lovely thing about that is if you see something growing in the system, different plants are there to do different jobs.
Yeah.
So if you see bull thistles, for instance, something that most farmers have, I spent my life persecuting them with chemistry. But the bull thistles are there to do a job. They're an indicator of compaction, of a low soil, calcium magnesium balance, high available nitrate. The way that they work is that they're actually managing that. Nature is using them, the system is using them to deal with a set of conditions. A lot of the challenge, our modern scientific paradigm, which is incredibly powerful and does some amazing things in some areas, it's very challenged by this regen thing because everything that we do on the ground has an impact on the ground. We have this illusion that we're the only sentient being on the playing field, yet everything is responding to us as well. So if we do something, then everything else is adjusting and changing to it. So the rules of the game, and this is one of the things we've really noticed, even over the last 6 years, the rules of the game have been changing continually. So as the ground becomes more functional, for instance, it may be, we're definitely holding a lot more water. When it's dry, when the weather's dry, the ground is wetter.
Yeah.
When the ground is wet, we can still travel over the ground. Obviously, there's a stage where you can't, but we've got much more play because the ground is sorting a lot of it out for us. And so again, that comes back into the risk thing. The ground naturally, the system naturally buffers stuff. So actually, were helping mitigate our risks by having a more resilient system. And simplistically, the farm is a lot more weatherproof.
Yeah.
And that, of course, because a lot of that isn't, okay, it's cost different money, it's cost effort, it's cost this, this low, we've had to go through this low cereal yields, low livestock yields, different thing because they're much shorter and very different. But actually what you're doing there is you're investing in the
I was going to
productive
say,
part.
it's an investment, isn't it? If every business takes a certain path for years and then realizes it can no longer be profitable in that activity, then if it's got the wherewithal to invest, to shift its model, it sets it up for the future.
Yeah.
And that's so whilst this is seemingly to me a return to a more traditional way of farming, by where the traditional farmer would read the land and do with it what he chooses, because we've shifted after the Second World War into an era where we had to maximize yields, and the development of fertilizers, etc., came to prominence. Now it's a reset to some of that ability to be able to read what's going on under our feet.
Yeah, it's a really interesting, there's a whole interesting discussion around that. Whether we are resetting, whether on the basis that time moves in one direction, whether we're actually moving forward, but what we're doing is we're pulling back skills that we might have learned before. There's a really interesting thing. Think about the plant thing that we talked about, about fertilizer, thinking particularly about ammonium nitrate. Most of it's made by the Haber-Bosch process. A lot of it is being made the wrong side of the Straits of Hormuz at the moment. The really exciting thing about the Haber-Bosch process, which was really developed in World War I, was that the output of it is useful in an agricultural point of view, but it's also and it was designed fundamentally for producing explosives. So from a country, a national resilience point of view, if you have an industry, which of course we don't because we now outsourced it because everybody's forgotten about it, which produces stuff that in peacetime can be used to grow food and in wartime can be switched straight into explosives manufacture, you've got a defense asset too. And that really underpinned this thing. And of course, at the time, there were a few visionaries, but we didn't really know the impact that we were having. And we've only been seeing the last 5-10 years. It's becoming clear because, of course, we as human beings, and my grandfather was born in 1870. We're late developers as a family. But even in 2 or 3 generations, how much has changed from a human point of view? But actually, it's a snapshot of time. And I think a lot of the stuff that we're looking at, we've focused on yields as in weight, but we're not looking at nutrient density. I said this thing that was really clear that the ground, once we started growing more complex stuff in the ground, because we weren't encouraging the ryegrass with the nitrogen. Perennial ryegrass loves nitrogen, and with nitrogen will outcompete everything else. So you have a monoculture. That's great. My continental cows loved eating that. That's what they love doing. My native breed shorthorns, they really like standing in the middle of a gorse bush. And now that we're not making the ryegrass competitive, all the other things have come back past it. And of course, your clovers, your legumes, they're all full of proteins. So suddenly you've got this incredibly powerful, rich fabric that you're feeding your livestock. And our vet bills have gone through the floor. The majority of our vet bills are spent on monitoring, on animal health, these various high health schemes to eradicate different diseases and things like that.
So did you change your breed, your herd, to suit your habitat?
We now are shorthorn Angus crossed into the middle, if that makes sense. that works well. Are you familiar with epigenetics? Again,
What do you
no,
think?
it's just so I'm not bored.
I
Basically
spoke
the
to a beef geneticist a couple of
yeah,
weeks, well,
yeah,
probably a couple of
yeah.
months ago now, and I'm
Uh,
lining up to speak to a gentleman from the Cattle Society. So, but no, don't be asking me questions like that.
yeah. The
Tell
the
me.
thing about epigenetics is its genetic evolution it is based on genetic mutation. But your genes, and so there's this works and it works well, and from a Darwinian point of view, it's great. And it's what's brought us here. But there's also this short-term cycle, which is when genes, effectively what genes are templates for making stuff. And they're a tangled ball, and bits of them are exposed and available as templates, and bits of them are closed up effectively. And what they can do much more quickly to deal with conditions or prevailing conditions is change the bits that are exposed. So you have the same set of genetics can express themselves in different ways to deal with different conditions. And so this is why I think they do, and it's been probably going on for 10 years, but it's really come to the fore in the last 5 years for understanding it. They've done some amazing stuff on people who have been through where 2 generations ago, if there were people who had no food because they were in a concentration camp or they were in a community which was going through famine or whatever it happens to be, very often for 2 generations, there will be children who have obesity problems.
Yeah, so carrying genetic markers.
They're carrying, so it's partly genetic markers, but it's the bit of the gene that is being made available to do the work of the gene. So it's a little bit like whether you pull your Land Rover out of your garage or your Ferrari.
Or my Volvo.
Or your Volvo. Actually, the thing about the Volvo is the lovely Volvo will do everything, won't it? Irritating. But you know what I mean? So it's a different, so a lot of it, we're trying to create conditions whereby we're finding our home same seed, for instance. There's a lot of research being done with, by a lot of the research community. This is brilliant. But we're finding that we now save our own seed. We've found that not only are we changing our system, but our seed is changing to suit our system, which is changing itself, as are our livestock, as are our grasses. So the whole system is changing and evolving. So the rules are changing all the time. And that's really powerful, but we need to have the confidence to manage it at a systems level. And rather than intervening if there's a problem at a focused level, it's all about creating conditions, managing overall change. If there is something that is fundamentally unacceptable, then you might have to do something about it. But again, a lot of it is that balance between creating conditions where what we want to happen happens.
Did you run educational visits to the
We
farm?
do.
Tell me about that.
We're doing quite a lot. We're doing quite a few school visits. And I did with a STEM. I'm a STEM ambassador too, which is, and I know it wasn't designed for farming, but it struck me that farming is all about science, technology, engineering, and maths. And there's quite a lot of people at schools who might not want to be nuclear physicists, but actually might get involved in building stuff or doing stuff or growing stuff.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we do quite a lot of work with the Country Trust, who are an amazing organisation who link up schools and farms. And in some cases, they'll link up a school, a farm, and a sponsor for the bus. Because especially if the kids are going to come out on their bus and the bus is going to be sitting there all day, it's not an insignificant cost. And that's a real challenge. We get a lot of the kids in key stages 1 and 2, which is great. Obviously, the part we play in that agenda and that plan is variable depending on how the school's doing it. We've got a couple of college groups coming through where they're looking at the challenges between environment and productivity. Here we very much see, we talked about the productive power earlier on. The two are two sides of the same coin. And a lot of our productivity may well be associated with biodiversity rather than producing explicit food. and the biodiversity has a role in producing the food. And that maybe our yields are now back up to pretty much where they were when we were chucking around nitrogen.
Yeah.
But the quality is very different, if that makes sense. What's going through the power of the food is different. And even, we rarely used to produce milling wheat. Now, we occasionally don't make the milling grade, but normally we do. I think there's many factors associated with that, but the system is much more tuned to producing good stuff. And again, so it's getting the kids chatting through these issues. The fact that we don't live in a world, we like to live in a world as the mad monkey, where things are black and white and simple. But actually, that's not the world we live in. And if we are defined by what's black and white and in the soundbite, then actually, I suspect we're not equipping ourselves very effectively from an evolutionary point of view. We're going to exit the gene pool pretty quick.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, and so, but we also do a bit with adult education, a few farmers, different groups. A lot of farmers, we're all sharing now, sharing mistakes, which is really powerful.
Do you say now? Do you remember it when you first came into farming?
Yes, there was a stage where everybody always had brilliant yields. And everybody was always complaining, obviously, because we did. I don't know whether you remember 2017, I think it was, which was quite a good year. Everything, weather was pretty good.
Yeah, I do remember that.
Pretty good. And we were all wandering around in the doldrums because we had nothing really good to complain about.
To moan about. Somebody else said, one of my guests, it's a bit of a bonkers model, isn't it, to operate in that fashion?
You wouldn't do it on the figures.
No.
I have a wonderful wife who's an economist and really good at numbers. And so she challenges me all the time. And there is this sort of grey zone in the middle, which is why we do it.
Yeah.
And there's nothing I would want to do that wasn't farming. But it comes back to the value spectrum. Money is important, but so is, so is quality of life. So is, your own particular drivers, your particular agendas. One thing that's really interesting from a regen point of view. And regen, lots of chat about it. Actually, for me, it's a mindset. Nothing more than that. There's lots of chat about, do we certify it? Having spent a bit of time in certification, we can't effectively. And if we do, we'll break it. There's lots of things you can certify, which are manageable systems and manageable effects. Things like organic farming. You can certify it. And then the point of certification is people will either buy something that's come from a system or not.
Yeah.
You can also certify things according to their qualities. So you can certify it because it meets a certain standard. But regen isn't that. It's a mindset. And there's many, many ways you can deal with it. And that's a powerful thing.
Do you think off the back of the regen, I'll call it a movement, or do you think off the back of it, organic farming gets a fillip?
I think possibly. I think there's a bit of misunderstanding, and from us as a community too. There was a questionnaire came around a couple of years ago, and that thing where you see a questionnaire and you can tell what answer they want. And the intent was to find out whether organic farmers felt regen was a threat. I think that Edith Balfour, one of the founders of the organic movement, I think she would have considered herself to be regenerative, because it's a mindset.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of organic farmers have this organic ethos, and that's fine. It's actually a regenerative ethos, and more possibly. A number of organic farmers are just doing the thing, and they're just not using pesticides.
Yeah.
That might work in some contexts. On mine, the two go hand in hand. Organic and regen, where the regen mindset is all about thinking about the system and the productive power of the ground.
Yep.
The organic piece is a certification process based on an ethos, and that you can market, and it's important. And the organic prices have been pretty good this year, and that's really powerful. But we need to be careful. I think that we're now talking more broadly about analysis of nutrient density of things like that, and about food as a medicine, if that makes sense. And I think that naturally grown food, especially organically grown food, is very powerful. And I think there's a difference. There's some research being done which suggests, we're always told we ought to eat oily fish because omega-3 fatty acids.
Yeah.
Grass-fed beef is richer in omega-3 fatty acids than oily fish is. But grain-fed beef isn't. It just has to have been grass-fed, I gather, for the last six weeks of its life. But that is able to conjecture. But of course, cattle weren't designed to eat grain.
No.
I think it's a very good way of putting a bit of condition on them and things like that.
Yeah.
And in a productive system, but I think we're now seeing lots of health benefits or not, or health impacts across society.
Yeah.
I think the dietary impact has got to have a part of that. And I think there's a huge amount we don't know.
Mm.
And I think that, there's a lot where everybody's very dependent on scientific research. And that's fine. It's a really important part of our decision-making process. But there's a hell of a lot that reduction of science doesn't tell us.
Yeah.
And I think we need to be careful about dogma. We need to be very cognizant of the fact that there's many drivers and there's lots of information. But we need to be thinking very carefully about what we put into our mouths, into our children's mouths.
Yeah, I've had this conversation with so many different people. And of course, we're in a system. So availability or accessibility of the right food is a challenge in some areas. So that problem needs to be addressed alongside it, doesn't it?
I'm trying at the moment to put in a local food hub. I've been doing a bit of work with some really interesting people who are doing it around the world. 20 years ago, everybody on the farm in the cottages had their own allotments, grew their own veg, or probably 30 years ago, to be fair. People were growing a lot of what they ate. And, all of the cottages, the farm cottages, have all got piggeries. Obviously, there hasn't been a pig in these for decades, but that was part of the system. So you have this thing now, everybody buys their meat cheaply. A lot of even serving the commoditized organic system, it leaves my farm boundary and disappears into a big pot. You should, given the paperwork that we send our livestock away with, you should be able to go to a supermarket and ask what sort of beast the bit of beef was and where it came from. And if you can't, you should really be asking why. Because certainly for the vast majority of its life, every cow has got more paperwork than most of us have. And I can tell you it's a pain in the neck, but we do it and we have to do it. We get hammered if we get it wrong. But I think we need to think really carefully and we need to challenge what we're trying to do. And it's quite complex from a regulatory point of view, is have a system where we can produce affordable food, good food at farm scale. It's not going to be cheap meat, certainly, because it costs. I've just driven some pigs down to the abattoir. It took me an hour, 2.5 hours there and then 2.5 hours back to get the pigs into the formal feed chain system. Yeah. They will then, so they've traveled whatever it is, 75 miles. They'll then travel to the butcher about 75 miles, and then they'll come to me to then sell into the system. Yeah. So lack of abattoirs, that's the problem we have. But there are real impacts to a lot of the regulatory challenges that we have in terms of local food security. We should be eating stuff. All the people who live in the cottages here, some of whom who work here, some of whom who live here, I think should have access to local food. Some of it grown themselves, and some of it marketed from local environments.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tricky. It's such a complex area. Well, I'm going to thank you first and foremost for battling through your lurgy.
Well, I apologise for that.
That's okay. Bless you again. But thank you. I really appreciate your time.
Well, no, it was lovely to chat. And as I say, I hope it was useful.
It will be. Absolutely. Get well soon.
Thank you.
And I'll
You be
be in
good.
touch. All right?
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. My thanks to Tom. I wasn't sure I'd be able to make a usable episode from our recording when I first listened back to this, thanks to a dodgy internet connection and Tom fighting off a dreadful cold. But the wonders of editing software meant that it hopefully didn't affect what you heard. I think you'll agree Tom's expertise and enthusiasm is a delight. So if your kid's school or college is looking to learn more about regenerative agriculture, or rare breeds, conservation or agroecology, or if you'd like to sponsor the cost of organising such a trip to the farm, I'm sure Tom would love to hear from you. I'll pop the web address for the Mindrum farm in the show notes. So, with all things regen buzzing in my head, I'm off to the Green Collective's conference in Harrogate this Wednesday. If you happen to be going, please let me know, or better still, come and say hi. You can't miss me. I'll be wearing some past your bedtime merch. Well, everyone loves a gilet, right? But for now, if it is past your bedtime, perhaps it's time to turn in. Until next time.